So welcome everyone to episode 4 of Ask a Developer on the Spawncast Network. And first things first, let's get some housekeeping out of the way. I do want to apologize for the lateness of this episode. I've been extremely busy working on the Jurassic Park Classic Games Collection, which, by the way, will be out digitally on November the 22nd on all platforms. All that aside, let's get into some of the questions. Now, for those people that are new to the Ask a Developer series, basically what happens is on the Spawncast Network, anyone that is subscribed to the Patreon, feel free to ask any developer questions and I'll be happy to answer them as we go. Now, I do have a bunch of questions here that I do want to get to, and we are getting a little bit caught up on everything, so I do apologize once again, but let's go ahead and get started with the questions. The first one is from Joshua Butts, and he says, MVG, my 11-year-old son has been creating board games and tabletop games that have been actually really fun and creative. He has been wanting to get into coding, and like most other kids, wants to make video games one day. What coding language programs do you recommend for first-time beginners? Any suggestions on PC laptop requirements I should get him to start coding on? Well, I will say that if your son is 11 years old, he's probably not really at that level where you want to kind of throw him into something like C++ or, Unity or Unreal Engine or anything like that. I think if you're at that age and if you are starting out in game development, you really want to get a grasp of the concepts, the game development concepts themselves. And I think there is a lot of kind of tools for, the beginners or for the younger folks out there. Even something like Roblox is something that can be used as a tool to make games with, of course. But even honestly, I would almost recommend something like Game Builder Garage on the Nintendo Switch, believe it or not, as a great first step. It's a tool that I think is pretty cheap to buy these days, by the way. I want to say it's around $25 or maybe $30. I've seen it heavily discounted. So for me, someone that is kind of jumping in for the first time, Game Builder Garage actually really is a very, very good tool. So I personally would say give that a go. If you're looking for something that's more, PC centric and you don't want to focus on the Nintendo Switch, then there are other things out there. As mentioned, Roblox is a good one, but another one that is really good for kind of entry level to learn things as you go would be Game Maker. That's a very good tool as well for, 2D, especially 2D kind of platform games as well. But I personally, if it was my son, 11 years old, I would probably get him a copy of Game Builder Garage for Christmas, and I'll let him, run wild with that. I think that's a really good way to go. Now, the next question is from Tobis, and I apologize if I butcher your name there. It's Tohbs, Tobias. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that, but the question is, what new technology are you excited about as a developer? Now, I think for me, my biggest excitement as a developer would be new things that we're starting to see when it comes to 3D. For example, ray tracing is continuing to evolve. I think ray tracing is an interesting topic to discuss because it seemed like when ray tracing was announced with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series, it didn't seem to get the respect that it deserved. It was kind of, disregarded as some technology that probably wouldn't last beyond this generation because it seemed like there was a lot of budget when it came to the game itself. It took a lot of budget and it took a lot of processing for something like ray tracing to be implemented. But we're starting to see ray tracing being used in really, really good ways. And I think that going forward, ray tracing is going to be one of those technologies that is used very, very well over time. And, there are rumors, obviously, with the next Switch having ray tracing support as well. So I think, ray tracing for me is probably the single most thing that I'm excited about as a developer when it comes to, game development. The next question is from Sir WYD. Some of these names, man, I'm having trouble with. It's UMSIRWID. I'm not sure if that's supposed to mean something, but the question is, as someone with minimal knowledge in game development, I was just wondering about the compatibility and potential issues with Switch 2 backward compatibility. Your video states it may be due to architecture changes, which is a fair point. However, I'm confused on how, with, say, PCs, is it fairly easy to play older games from a decade, also with newer hardware. I know when you get older, 15 to 20 plus year old games, it gets harder. But with a change from my old GTX 750 to the new RTX 3080, it was a relatively smooth upgrade with nearly identical compatibility for games. Is this due more to NVIDIA drivers or other factors in the PC space that vary wildly from consoles? Sorry for the long questions. I'm just curious about what the major differences are. So to answer this question, when we talk about Switch 2 backward compatibility, first thing I do want to say is I do believe Nintendo will solve for backward compatibility. So I do think there will be some form of implementation on the next Switch hardware. I think if Nintendo completely omits it, that is an absolute miss from their behalf, and I think they're very much aware of that. But the question is, how do they get there? How do they offer Switch 2 backward compatibility? Now, you kind of suggested, you went from an old GTX graphics card to a new one, and everything kind of just seems to work without any real big deal. Now, the main difference between your example on the PC where you said you went from a GTX 750 to a RTX 3080 was that you simply installed the new graphics card and installed a brand new driver for it. So you went onto the GeForce website and updated your driver to, a modern driver that supports the RTX 3080. Unfortunately, on the Nintendo Switch, the driver itself is statically embedded into every single Switch game. So what that means is there's a Tegra X1 graphics driver that's kind of embedded statically with the actual game. Now, that's not exactly the right way to describe it, but think of it that way. Think about the driver itself kind of being embedded into the actual ROM itself, right? So how do you actually then, take that apart and put in a new driver? And if you think of it that way, the only real way to get around something like that is to basically rebuild the game, repackage the game with the updated driver in place, right? So in order to do that, what we're talking about is providing a patch rather than backward compatibility in the truest sense of the word, where basically what you do is you get a cartridge and you stick it into the new hardware and everything should just work. So that is really the biggest kind of hurdle that I'm seeing when it comes to, backward compatibility on the Switch. Now, having said that, I do believe, again, that Nintendo will offer backward compatibility on the Switch 2 or whatever we call the new hardware. But really, it's a matter of how they approach it. Do they put in a legacy Tegra X1 on the motherboard and basically manage it that way? That's definitely a possibility because Nintendo has done that before over the years, as we know. Do they basically just detect a Switch game that has been installed and just download a updated patch for it and then let you play it that way? That's also another option as well. So we'll just have to wait and see how things go. And hopefully that does answer your question. I know it was a little bit long-winded, but hopefully you kind of get the differences between, drivers on the PC versus a kind of a static, GPU driver that embeds itself with every single Switch game on a game console. The next question is from DC Fat Cat. When you are porting a game from the Genesis, there used to be deviations in the chips that were used, particularly the Yamaha sound chips, or like the Genesis had better sound through the headphone jack than it did through the AV out. Would you ever add in a sound option like TV grain so you could feel the difference between the different levels of sound quality? I think when it comes to different systems, there's always a need to kind of make your customers happy. So if you were someone that used a Genesis 1 or if you used a Genesis 2 and you have, in your mind a good feeling for what sound should sound like, then we basically want to kind of cover both of those things. And I think about something like the Genesis Mini or the Genesis Mini 2, which basically had a toggle between the Genesis 1 sound and the Genesis 2 sound, right? So where we possibly can, we like to do things like that as well. So I would definitely add in as many options as possible to basically keep as many of our, as many people happy, right? So I think that's really the best way to answer it. Like, as someone that, grew up playing console games, I have a certain way that I like to think about things, but someone else may have a different way of thinking about things. And I think that the whole goal of bringing back old retro games with, the Carbon engine is to basically make everyone feel that nostalgia that they had and make everyone happy, but also obviously introduce updated quality of life. So we would definitely want to add, additional sound options as well if the need actually arose. Now, the next question is from Suburba Barboy, and they ask, 343 made the slip space engine using contractors so that when it was time to make a new Halo, none of the employees or current contractors had any experience with the new engine, resulting in very long development cycle and causing the live service to constantly be behind schedule. With that said, do you think there is an overuse of contract work in the game industry? Could these problems be solved if money spent on contract work was spent on hiring more employees to stay during the entire development? Wow, this is a lot. I'll try to answer this as best I can. I will say that I have worked both as a contractor and a full-time employee in the games industry, so I have a taste of both of those things. I do think that contractors really need to be treated with more respect when it comes to working in the industry. There is some kind of stigma when you are a contractor that you're not a part of the team. And I will say that, disclaimer, when I worked as a contractor, I worked at Night Dive Studios as a contractor, and they were nothing but family to me. In fact, they still are going to treat me as one of the team there, which is awesome. But I think, for working in the AAA studio, if you're a contractor, then there is definitely a stigma that you're not really a part of the team. You're kind of there just to get the job done. And unfortunately, when it comes to the industry, especially this year, we've seen so many layoffs, so many studios kind of, under so much turmoil and uncertainty that when it comes to making cuts, contractors, unfortunately, are usually the first ones to be let go. And when I say let go, that's not necessarily the right term, because when you are a contractor, you have a certain contract period, and then, at the end of that contract period, hopefully that contract period will get renewed or updated for like another 12 months or whatever the duration is. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of studios kind of sit on contractors too much and don't really, think about the long-term ramifications for retaining employees or retaining contractors and converting them to full-time employees. But I personally think that, the industry has a lot of contractors, let's be honest. And usually it falls into areas such as QA, where basically they bring in a whole bunch of contractors to help test your game, identify bugs, and get them all fixed. But unfortunately, when the game ships out, the need for those QA teams don't really apply as much anymore. And unfortunately, those contractors kind of get let go, or they don't get their contracts updated, and they have to kind of find something else. It's just one of those real unfortunate parts of the industry. But I do think you bring up a good point. I think that if there was more money spent retaining talent and converting contractors to full-time employees, that would definitely go a long way to alleviate some of those concerns. But unfortunately, the video game industry is so volatile right now, and there's just so much uncertainty in the air with studios closing, firings, layoffs, all that stuff. It's something I don't particularly see changing in the near future, unfortunately. Now, the next question is from Varang807. Do you think game developers are padding time estimates and are too cautious about algorithms and code? Varang, I think estimating time when it comes to work is one of the hardest things that you can do. If you're in management or if you're a lead and it's your responsibility to scope out a timeline based on development estimates, it's very, very difficult to really push that down. And the thing is, even though your developers may come back and give you an accurate assessment of time, there's always going to be things that get thrown into the mix. There's always going to be these kind of uncertain things that happen during the timeline during a game project. For example, let's say a development team says it's going to take 3 weeks to implement this system into the game. All it takes is for one developer to, turn in their resignation for whatever reason. I'm not saying that they were unhappy about, maybe they found another job or something like that. And essentially that really just blows out the timeline, right? And especially if that resource was a key resource. So I think there's definitely a need to add, to pad estimates out. And the way that I usually like to work when it comes to estimating for time is to offer basically three different types of estimates. The kind of the best case scenario where, in a perfect vacuum, what is the fastest way you can get something done? And then there's kind of the medium one, which is kind of the average, typically how long is it going to take given external things that may come up. And then there's the worst case scenario where, it may be just a little bit too cautious, as you said, but it kind of protects yourself from, being in a situation where you've underestimated or overestimated a piece of work. So look, I think game developers are cautious about algorithms and code simply because they know exactly what it means if your estimates, are too small or they're too long. And estimating time accurately really just does come with experience. Next question is from DC Fat Cat. They ask, as a developer, how do you maintain wrist health? Gamers are told to take it easy, but as a developer, it's not an option. I think really it's all about movement. So, I'll work for an hour and a half, and then I'll get up and walk around, maybe go for a walk around the block or something like that, drink some water, and then come back and kind of continue on. That's usually the way that I like to do work, and hopefully, it works for other people as well. Now, the next question comes from James. He asks, is running the Switch in dock mode at 720p beneficial in any way for performance? Kind of the difference between 720p and 1080p on the Switch is actually quite significant when it comes to performance. That's why you see a lot of games kind of max out at 720p. A lot of games don't run at 1080p, and I think that is really the main reason. But when it comes to kind of overclocking tests, usually a lot, it's kind of more beneficial to run the game in handheld mode, kind of push all the clocks and have it running at 720p and kind of perform your test that way. In my experience with 1080p docked resolutions, it's almost impossible to overclock the Switch at any kind of level of performance where you can get a solid 60 FPS. So yeah, 720p is definitely beneficial for performance. DC Fat Cat asks, when working on a project, do you prefer an Agile or waterfall approach? For my agency, we talk about Agile planning, but end up getting stuck in waterfall approaches. DC Fat Cat, I think as someone who has worked both in Agile, in full Agile, and in waterfall, most of the time, a lot of places where you work, you kind of do a combination or some type of, I call it Wagile, which is the waterfall Agile model, where you take some Agile things and you also kind of apply waterfall things. So every morning you may have a stand-up, right? A morning kind of stand-up, but you may not have those 2-week sprints like you have with a true Agile approach. So it really depends on the project, but the places that I've worked, limited run games and Night Dive, we kind of tend to work in more of a waterfall approach, which is obviously the more traditional approach, but we do obviously have, daily stand-ups and things like that. And, there's obviously a lot of Agile that's also added on, but usually it's like a hybrid approach for the most part. Now, the last question is from the Casual Noob Gamer, and they ask, with always online game requirements, for example, in GT7, Diablo 4, and specifically Forza Motorsport, do always online requirements for a game affect a game's performance like resolution and FPS, similar to how Denuvo checks online licenses? I ask because I feel Forza Motorsport on the Series X does not look great for the most powerful console compared to previous titles. Or if not the always online, then why does it not look as good? I don't think the always online is the reason why Forza Motorsport may not look as good as, previous titles. I think ultimately at the end of the day, Forza Motorsport, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I don't have any insight into, the development plan and the project plan and how long it took to make the game. I'm certainly, not an insider in any means when it comes to this stuff, but just with my experience with Forza Motorsport, and I've only played probably about 5 or 6 hours of the game, but I have seen many issues, especially on the PC. Ultimately, it really comes down to the fact that this game was coming in pretty hot. I feel like there was a line drawn in the sand from someone, someone at Microsoft or Xbox or whatever, that said, look, we have to really get this game out. Forza Motorsport has been in the works for a while. It's been delayed as well. And I think ultimately a decision was made just to, ship the game as it was. Now, it will get fixed, and I think you'll start to see that the game looks better and better over time. Forza Motorsport still is a absolutely brilliant looking game, even with the less than stellar release, I will say. But to answer your question, I don't feel like the online game requirements really makes a difference when it comes to the performance and the visuals of the game. I think really it just has to do with the project itself. I feel like Forza Motorsport kind of had a bit of a shaky development through its life cycle. But again, I can't, obviously I can't confirm that. It's just the way that I'm seeing things with the game when it first came out. And that's going to be all the questions for episode 4 of Ask a Developer. As mentioned at the start of the episode, if you do have a question you want to ask for episode 5, please get them in on the Spawncast Patreon. I'll be happy to answer them next month, and I'll definitely be a lot quicker this next time around with answering your questions. But great questions, guys. Keep them coming in, and we'll catch you guys next time. Have a good one.